Hello, welcome to Michelle Sews Again. I'm Michelle. Today I'm going to share with you my experience in sewing the Closet Core Patterns Kalle shirt dress, which I'm wearing. So if that sounds interesting to you, then stay tuned. Okay, so today I am going to talk you through my experience in sewing the Kalle shirt dress. It's something that's been on my radar for a long time. I know it's one of the cult favorites. It's all over the Instagram. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. All right, so I'll give you a little bit of a description about it and the fabric requirements, the sizing, and then I'll get into my experience. So from a description standpoint, this is a loose body skimming style pattern. It comes with multiple options that you can mix and match however you want. So it has three different lengths: a cropped length, a tunic length, and a dress length. I'm talking a lot with my hands these days. Anyway, it comes with two different collars, a band collar and a standard collar. It comes with three different plackets. You have a hidden placket, a standard placket, and a popover placket, and let's see, and two different back pleats. So you can do the back pleat either as a box, or you can reverse it and do an inverted box pleat. And you can mix and match all of those features however you see fit. They all have the same sleeve, where it's kind of just a grown-on sleeve with a cuff that you attach. And then for the cropped version, the hem is finished with a hem facing. For both the tunic and the dress, the hem is finished with a bias tape. And it gives you a pattern piece to make the bias tape out of your fabric. You can use the continuous bias tape method that you can get tutorials from Mari Sews. I'll link her below. I used the pattern piece and just did it that way. Which version did I make? I made the dress length version. I used the standard collar. I used the standard placket, and I used the regular box pleat on the back. So those are the features that I used. From a fabric requirements perspective, it asks for a light to medium weight woven or shirting. And basically the lighter, it all depends on what kind of look you're going for. Obviously a lighter weight with drapier movements is going to give you a freer flowing kind of a garment. Something like a quilt and cotton will give you a more structured version. So just depends on what look you're going for. So I used this 3-ounce linen that I got off fabricsstore.com. I will link it below, and it is one that I ice dyed. I did an ice dye along video where I showed you my process for how I ice dye, and this was the fabric that I made during that video. So I will link it in the cards up here. I will also link it below in case you're interested in that. But yeah, so this is a fabric that I made. I'm very happy with it. I love the colors. All right, sizing wise, it comes in sizes 0 to 20. Now here's a perfect example of why you should look at the finished garment measurements, because if I only looked at the body measurements that coordinated with the sizing in this pattern, I wouldn't have made it because it doesn't look like it would fit me. So sizes 0 to 20, the bust size goes from 31 inches to 46 inches, and I have a 50.5-inch bust. The waist goes from 24 to 39 inches. My waist is 46 inches. The hips go from 33 to 48, and my hips are 53 inches. So clearly I'm on the outside of all of those, and I'm not one that's gonna grade a pattern up. It's just not something I'm interested in doing. So then I looked at the finished garment measurements, and I had more than enough room. So the finished garment measurements, a bust goes from 39.7 inches to 54.1. So you can see for the smaller size, you're looking at almost 9 inches of ease. For the larger size, it is about 8 inches of ease. For the waist measurements, you're going in the finished garment from 39.7 to 54.1. So you can see the bust and waist measurements are the same. So it goes straight down. And then the hips, it grades out just a little bit. The hips are 41.3 inches to 56.3 inches. So you can see in the finished measurements for the largest size, there's plenty of ease in there, and that's what made me feel like I could make the largest size and I would be good to go. So that's what I did. I made the size 20. I could have graded down, I could have sized down to the 18 and it still would have fit me. I don't feel like the amount of ease that that would have provided would be an amount of ease that I would be comfortable with, but it wouldn't have been body hugging, so I could have done it. So what I think I would do if I made this again, because I do feel like there's a lot of excess in the waist area. I'm fine with it the way that it is. I actually think I'm going to end up adding waist ties to this just to cinch it in just a smidge. If I don't feel like undoing it and putting the waist ties in, then maybe I'll get one of those clips that you can put in the back just to cinch it in a little bit. Or maybe even, oh, that's what I could do. I could add a little bit of elastic in the middle of the back piece inside of a casing. You know how you do that just in the middle? I could do that to kind of pull it in just a smidge at the waist. And I think that might be what I do. So in the future, if I make this again, I would probably grade down to the 18 for the waist and then grade back out to the 20 for the hips, because there's a lot of ease in the hip, but that's how I'm more comfortable, especially when I'm sitting. When I'm sitting right now, there's not a ton of ease in the in the hip. So I feel like if I graded down in the hip, it might be a little bit too snug when I sit, but grading down in the waist, there's enough here where I feel like it would fit fine. So for my body shape, that's what I would do. I would leave the 20 at the bust, go down to the 18 for the waist, and then go back out to the 20 for the hips. But the way that it is now, I'm pretty happy with it. From a pattern piece perspective, the entire pattern has 17 pattern pieces. Now you don't need all 17. It's going to depend on what version you make and what features you choose for that version. The version that I made with the dress, the standard collar, the standard placket, I used 11 pieces. The pattern was drafted for somebody that is 5'6". I am 5'1", so you would think that I would have shortened it, but I didn't, because I held the front pattern piece up to my body, you know, at the shoulder, and kind of held it to my body down, and I liked the length of it. I maybe could shorten it an inch, maybe 2, but I'm actually happy with this, and I think once I do that cinching at the back, it's going to pull it up a smidge, but I'm happy with it. I like it. So maybe I would shorten a future version. There's room for me to do that, but I didn't do it in this case because where the pattern piece fell, I thought once I hemmed it that it would take it up. I didn't realize that I was hemming it with bias tape, which really didn't shorten the length from the pattern piece at all. It just turned it under a smidge. So anyway, I'm happy with the length. Obviously you will need to decide the length for yourself. There are shorten and lengthen lines on the pattern, so you could easily make adjustments there. They do offer sew along instructions for every major step. So, and that's on their website. It is not a video, it is just more in-depth instructions with photographs, so it is a little bit easier to follow along. I used the sew along instructions for the yoke, for the yoke and the collar. Everything else, the instructions in the instruction booklet that comes with the pattern were sufficient for me, but the yoke and the collar kind of tripped me up a little bit, so I did use the instructions there, or the sew along instructions there. Let's see. Somewhere between the placket and the yoke, I got a little bit turned around, and after I put the yoke on, everything was backwards. So I ended up, well, The good news is that the way that they have you finish the plackets, both sides, both the button placket side and the inside, are just as nice on the inside as they are on the outside. And because my fabric is the same on both sides, because I dyed it, turning it inside out so that my yoke, I don't know how to explain this, because the yoke looks the same on both sides. My stitching on that was on the opposite side after I top stitched the yoke in place wasn't as clean on the inside. Maybe I wasn't backwards. No, I was backwards because my button placket is backwards. So yeah, there was something between the two. My good side was on one side of the yoke and my good side on the placket was on the other side. But luckily my good side, my bad side on the plackets were not bad. So I ended up just flipping it around and using the wrong side as my right side. So what that ended up meaning is that my plackets are backwards, so my buttons are buttoning the male way, which honestly, I mean, isn't that old-fashioned these days? Does there need to be a female side and a male side? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I don't think so. I think that's old-fashioned and something that should just be done away with. That's my feeling. All right, so then the burrito method for the yoke was very interesting. I'd never done that before. Of course, I haven't made anything with a yoke ever. So the whole yoke thing was new for me, but I mean, it's just, you know, the yoke is just this shape, right? So if you didn't do the burrito method, then you would just finish the inside with whatever seam finishing you would typically use. It's really nice that the burrito method is where you kind of, I don't think I can explain it very well, but basically the inside of the yoke looks just as good as the outside of the yoke, depending on how good you are at top stitching. So my inside of my yoke does not look as good as my outside. It's not terrible, but I much prefer my outside stitching. All right, so then I did allude to the fact that you use bias tape for the hem, and that's for the tunic length and the dress length. For the short length, you're using a facing. So I made the bias tape using my ice-dyed fabric, but I used the pattern piece that came with the pattern, and you cut, I think, 4 pieces and you sew them together at the right angles and, you know, open it up that way. And so honestly, that bias tape finishing for this really, like on the side hems or the sides, the curve is pretty steep, and using that bias finish made hemming this easy breezy. There was no problem in that step whatsoever. So then we come to the second to last step, which is the standard collar. So I've put collars on before, not often. I did one back when I originally started sewing back in the 80s, and I did one last year. I made a style arc pattern. It might have been the Dahlia tunic. I can't remember which one it was. Anyway, so I made a collar. The one I made in the 80s came out great. I think I've said it before, I was fearless back then. Nothing held me back. I jumped in and I did everything that I was interested in, and I pretty much did it well. I don't know why, as we get older, we get more hesitant to do things, but I did one last year. My collar didn't come out great. That shirt also had a button placket. My buttonholes didn't come out great. I didn't keep that shirt. I got rid of it when I was purging before we moved from Pennsylvania. This time, I wanted to take my time. I wanted everything to come out really nice. So here's what I found funny. The very first paragraph under the collar instructions for the standard 2-piece collar says, "The following method for sewing a 2-piece collar is unconventional but beginner friendly." Well, as I was going through the process, I did not agree with that statement at all. In hindsight, after I finished putting the collar together, I was like, oh, that was easy. I made it way harder than it needed to be. So I did jump to the sew along instructions. And so I'll just kind of walk you through really high level. So basically your interface, you have 2 collar stand pieces and 2 collar pieces, right? So you interface one side, one piece of each of those. So you interface one piece of the stand, you interpiece one piece of the collar. The way that they have you put this together, now I don't remember what the standard process is, so I will walk you through this process. So they have you put the interfaced side of the stand right sides together with the top, and you leave 5/8 of an inch on either side hanging on the hanging past the placket of the shirt or the dress, and you pin that in place. They suggest that you clip the curves on the stand to help it lay in place. I will tell you, my first attempt, I couldn't get it to fit. And what I did was, because my fabric is linen, I went and steamed it, and that kind of shrunk it back up so that the pieces did what they were supposed to. But the very first time I was pinning it together, I was like, crap, I must not have cut the right size stand, because it was fitting inside the placket seams. The one thing on this pattern that I did think was not necessarily good instructions is they didn't have you stay stitch the neckline until further into the instructions. Most patterns that I've sewn over the last year, if you needed to stay stitch the neckline, it was one of the very first things that you did to keep it from stretching out. So I wish that I had done that myself at the beginning, because my neckline did stretch out. The steaming definitely helped, and I was able to get the collar stand piece to fit once I steamed it back together. So you clip the curves of the stand, then you lay it out, you get it to fit along all the notch marks, then you sew it in place. Then you flip it up, you iron both the collar stand and the seam allowance facing up. Then you place the collar pieces right sides together. You stitch the sides and the top. You clip the corners, you trim the seam allowance, then you flip it right side out, and then you top stitch the collar. And then you take the collar right sides together with the stand, and you stitch those in place. And then you leave the collar piece down, and you put the uninterfaced stand on top of that. So at this point, you've got the collar stand facing up that was sewn onto the shirt. You've got the collar sewn to the opposite edge of the collar stand. And now you've got the collar in between the 2 pieces of the collar stands. So it's sandwiched in between, and then you sew that in place. Well, actually, before you sew the uninterfaced side of the stand onto the collar, you press the bottom of it up 5/8 of an inch, so that after you sew it on and you flip it over, the pressed side matches the stitched side of the one that's sewn onto the shirt. And then you top stitch the whole darn thing in place, and then you're done. So it actually ended up, I probably didn't explain that very well, but it ended up being pretty straightforward. It's just the wording in the instructions, I don't know how I got tripped up, but the wording in the instructions were not straightforward, in my opinion. Now that I've done it, I get it, it's pretty easy. But walking it through for the first time, I got confused. So I definitely encourage you to go to the sew along if you're not familiar with sewing collars on. What was very frustrating to me is I started out using the instructions in the booklet, and I got the collar stand on, and then I got the collar on, and then I thought I was doing it wrong, because when I started to read the instructions for putting the second part of the collar stand on, I thought I had done it all wrong. I unpicked everything. I unpicked the collar, I unpicked the stand, and then I was like, all right, now I got to go to the sew along. When I went to the sew along, everything that I had done was right. Oh well, what's done is done. And I have a very lovely collar now. It worked out well and it is pretty spot on, I have to say. All right, so then the last thing that I did was the sleeve cuffs. And I did screw up there a little bit, but it ended up working out fine. You sew the short ends of the cuff together, then you fold it in half lengthwise with wrong sides together, and then you sew the cuff onto the sleeve, and then you press it so that the seam allowance is toward the cuff. And then you're supposed to fold the seam allowance under and top stitch it in place so that the raw edges are caught underneath. Well, mine was kind of bulky, so I decided to grade one side of the seam. I graded the wrong side. So I graded the side that I needed to flip over. Oh well, not a big deal. What I ended up doing was serging that whole seam and then just top stitching it in place. So it was fine. And then I was done. Well, no, I wasn't. Then I still needed the buttonholes and the buttons. So I spent time, I have one of those Simflex things, my Simflex, and I marked my buttonholes out using my Simflex to make sure they were spaced correctly and they were starting where I wanted them to. And I have an automatic buttonholer on my machine, so I used that. And I put one of the buttons, the way that mine works is it's this big long white piece. I don't have it here to show you. And then you put one of the buttons actually in the back end of it, and that's supposed to tell the buttonholer how big to make your buttonhole. So I put this green button in the end of my buttonholer and used that for all of my buttonholes. The buttonholes themselves were probably the easiest part of this whole thing. Like, they just went like a dream, one after the other, beautiful. Then I sewed all my buttons on, and I did the fray check at the corners, you know, the ends of the buttonholes like you're supposed to do. Then yesterday when I went to button this thing up, man, I could barely get those buttons through. It took a lot of force. Like, I got a little bit of a workout putting all these buttons through the buttonholes. Luckily, I don't have to undo them because the neck hole is big enough I can just slip this sucker on. But I was a little frustrated that happened, that my buttonholes are just a little small. I was able to get them through without messing up my buttonholes, so everything worked out fine. But yeah, I'm not sure what to do different there in the future because I followed the instructions exactly. I used the button as guidance. Even though I did do the fray check, so I thought maybe I had overused the fray check. So about halfway through, I took my little embroidery scissors and I snipped through like to the edge as far as I could without snipping through the bar tacks at the end of the buttonholes. And that made it a little bit easier, but I still had to use a lot of force to get those buttons through. So I don't think that was 100% of the problem. I don't know. Anyway, at the end of the day, I have a finished dress that I am very happy with. Once I get that cinching done in the back, I think it's gonna be like a perfect dress for me. And I'm gonna be proud to wear it to my husband's reunion tomorrow night. So I'm excited about that. Actually, I would have already gone to the reunion by the time you see this video, and I will tell you now that I had a great time because I'm gonna go with intention to have a good time, which means that I will. So anyway, I would love to know if you found this review helpful. I know it's really late to the game because this pattern's been out quite some time and there are a boatload of reviews out, but their review wasn't my review. So let me know if you've made this dress, if you had the same issues that I've had, or is it just me because I'm new to these steps? Yeah, let me know what your thoughts are. And wherever you are, I hope that the weather is amazing. I hope you're able to get some sewing in, and thank you so much for joining me. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.